A white man tried to kick a black CEO out of first class, but when the truth came out, the entire plane was stunned. What happens next will leave you speechless. He barked at a CEO to leave his seat, sneering that first class isn't for you. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. Adrian Cross stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 781 with the precision and composure of a man used to navigating boardrooms and closed doors. The hiss of the air conditioning mingled with the soft rustle of newspapers and the dull thuds of luggage being loaded into overhead compartments. It was early evening, the golden hue of the fading sun casting a soft glow over the windows. But none of that mattered. Not now. He barely had time to take a breath when a voice struck out, sharp and intrusive. "That seat doesn't belong to you." Adrian halted mid-step. The voice came from a tall, broad-shouldered white man standing halfway down the aisle. The man's stance was wide, one arm braced against the seat back, the other pointing directly at seat 3A, the very seat printed on Adrian's boarding pass. His name, Adrian Cross, was embossed in silver on the luggage tag hanging from his sleek leather briefcase. But the man hadn't asked for a name. He had simply judged. Adrian lifted his gaze to meet the man's eyes. Cold, arrogant, the type of look he had grown used to over the years, though not immune to. He kept his voice level, the edge of experience sharpening every syllable. "I believe there's a misunderstanding," Adrian said calmly, holding up his boarding pass. "That's my seat." The man didn't even glance at it. "You heard me," the stranger sneered, standing straighter now, blocking the aisle entirely. "I don't know how you got into this cabin, but you're not sitting here. First class isn't for—" He paused, letting the sentence dangle like a noose, filled with implication. "Outsiders?" Adrian blinked slowly. The word hung there, poisonous and obvious. He took a careful step forward, not aggressive, just insistent. "I have the correct boarding pass. Seat 3A. I'll take my seat now." The man chuckled under his breath as though amused by the sheer audacity of the moment. His suit, though expensive, was wrinkled, his tie slightly crooked. He had the air of someone who believed ownership was inherited, not earned. Several passengers peeked over their newspapers, ears now fully tuned into the brewing confrontation. A few whispered. A couple chuckled. None intervened. From behind, a steward approached, young, pale, visibly uncomfortable. "Is everything all right here?" the steward asked, voice hesitant, eyes flickering between the two men. "This man is trying to take a seat that's not his," the white man snapped, not even waiting for Adrian to respond. "I'm not paying this much money to sit next to someone who doesn't belong here." Adrian turned slightly toward the steward, keeping his voice even and respectful. "My name is Adrian Cross. This is my boarding pass." He handed it over with a steady hand. The steward took it with a nervous glance, read it, blinked, and looked again. It does say 3A, he mumbled, then quickly handed it back. "There doesn't seem to be a mistake, sir." "There has to be," the man insisted, stepping closer, trying to tower over Adrian. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Adrian didn't flinch. "I didn't come here for introductions. I came to fly." The air thickened, the cabin's luxurious silence now charged with tension. The steward stood frozen, unwilling to confront the angry man but also clearly unsure of how to proceed. Adrian could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin pressing into his back. It wasn't just about the seat anymore, it was about power, about who was allowed to sit in which space and who got to decide. Still, Adrian remained where he was, his eyes not leaving the man's face. "Step aside," Adrian said quietly. "Please." But instead of stepping aside, the man took out his phone and began snapping photos. "I'll report this," he said, "to the airline, to the TSA, to whoever will listen. You're impersonating someone. You probably switched tickets or got in with someone else's ID. There's no way someone like me belongs in first class," Adrian finished for him, voice calm but edged with steel. The man didn't answer. The steward shifted uncomfortably, then looked toward the front of the cabin, as though hoping someone would appear and make the decision for him. The other passengers avoided Adrian's gaze, suddenly finding their coffee cups or in-flight magazines incredibly interesting. Adrian glanced down at the pass again, then to the seat. His seat. He didn't ask again. He simply walked forward and sat down, placing his briefcase neatly beneath the seat in front of him. The window beside him framed the runway, but he didn't look outside. He was listening, to the silence that followed, the tension that rippled, the breath the cabin had collectively held. The man didn't sit. Instead, he stood there, fuming. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "People like you always think you've won something." Adrian ignored him. The steward lingered near the aisle, then turned and walked away without another word, clearly not ready to challenge either man further. But the damage was done. Lines had been drawn, and though Adrian had reached his seat, he knew this was not the end of the encounter. He reached into his inner coat pocket, pulling out a small notepad and a pen, not to write anything down yet, but to remind himself who he was: a strategist, a leader, someone who didn't react to noise but waited for signal. The man finally stormed back to his own seat, muttering under his breath. Adrian adjusted his cuffs and straightened his spine. His objective was simple: arrive in Halvorth and deliver the presentation that could shape the future of Lumivia Systems. He hadn't come to fight, but conflict had found him, and now it was watching him closely. He turned slightly, not to speak, but to make his presence known. This would not be dismissed. Not this time. The man's outburst had revealed more than prejudice. It had exposed a fault line in a system that assumed silence would hold. The tension in the cabin sharpened as Douglas repeated his order, louder this time. "Get out of this section before I call someone." Adrian sat down anyway. His movement was slow, deliberate, calm, but firm. The soft click of his briefcase settling between his feet was the only sound he made as he straightened his jacket and folded his hands in his lap. His jaw clenched for a moment, but his face remained composed, eyes focused on the seat ahead. He had experienced moments of discomfort before, rooms where his presence was questioned, meetings where assumptions greeted him before introductions, but rarely had the hostility been this open, this loud. Douglas stood in the aisle beside him, face flushed and breathing hard like a man insulted at his own dinner table. "You think you can just take that seat?" he spat, whipping out his phone and pointing the camera directly at Adrian. "I'm reporting this to the airline." "This is fraud." The flash flickered. Adrian didn't move. Across the cabin, other passengers stirred. Most wore tailored suits and expensive watches. A few raised newspapers or tablets higher in front of their faces, as though physical objects could shield them from involvement. Yet their eyes betrayed them, darting sideways over the edges of folded broadsheets, glancing quickly, curiously. None of them spoke. None of them stood. The steward, a thin young man named Ian with a crisp uniform and hesitant posture, finally stepped forward. His shoes barely made a sound on the plush carpet, but the tension in his shoulders was visible. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing Adrian, not Douglas. "I need to check your boarding pass, if you don't mind." Adrian looked up slowly. His voice, when it came, was quiet and even. "Of course." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, produced the pass, and handed it over without fanfare. His movements were smooth, practiced, the motions of a man who had learned long ago to carry proof without pride. Ian examined the pass. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second. Then, quickly recovering his professional expression, he gave a short nod. "This is correct." "You're in the right seat, Mr. Cross." Douglas's mouth opened and closed once, like a man momentarily robbed of words. His grip on his phone tightened. "That has to be a mistake," he said loudly. "There's no way someone like him has a seat in first class." The air thickened. That phrase, "someone like him," hung in the space between them, poisoning the silence. Adrian didn't flinch, but his fingers briefly curled into a fist on the armrest before relaxing again. He said nothing. His silence was louder than Douglas's outburst. Ian stepped back, uncertain whether to speak again. He glanced toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin, perhaps hoping another crew member would appear to take over the uncomfortable moment. But no one came. Douglas took a step closer. "You need to move before this gets worse," he warned. "There's a certain standard in this cabin." "You're not it." Adrian turned his head slightly, finally meeting Douglas's eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet strength that unnerved. "You've made your position clear," he said, voice low. "And I've made mine." Douglas shook his head in disbelief, stepping back and muttering again about entitlement and rules being ignored these days. He returned to his seat across the aisle, but the battle wasn't over. His posture screamed unfinished business. Adrian exhaled softly, more in thought than in relief. He could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin, judging, calculating, measuring. But he remained composed, unwilling to let their silence shape his resolve. What none of them knew, what Douglas would never guess, was that Adrian's connection to this flight went deeper than a ticket. The very aircraft they sat in, the sleek design of the cabin, the software running the entertainment screens, it all tied back to Adrian's company. Lumavia Systems wasn't just a name on his briefcase, it was the invisible thread woven into the airline's infrastructure. He had helped broker the deal that modernized this fleet. He had sat across boardroom tables with the very executives who decided how this plane operated. And yet none of that shielded him from this moment. The steward lingered near the curtain, uncertain. Other passengers remained silent, their curiosity now mingled with guilt. Some looked out the window, others fiddled with their tray tables. The entire cabin seemed caught in a suspended breath, everyone waiting to see what would happen next, no one willing to shape it. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable. He wasn't surprised, disappointed perhaps, but not surprised. He had long ago learned that success did not insulate him from ignorance, but he had also learned that silence, used wisely, could be a weapon. Across the aisle, Douglas pulled out his phone again, scrolling furiously, perhaps looking for someone to call or text. He didn't yet realize that the man he had tried to humiliate was not only in the right seat, but sat in a chair paid for in part by his own enterprise. Adrian adjusted his cufflinks, settling deeper into the seat. His objective had shifted. This flight was no longer just about reaching Halworth for a board presentation. It was now about something else entirely. In the far corner of the cabin, another steward appeared, whispering something urgently to Ian, who nodded and disappeared behind the curtain. Adrian watched, his mind already moving forward, anticipating steps, calculating responses. The drama hadn't ended. It had only changed shape. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they had to act but dreading what might come next. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Security! Someone get security! This man is a fraud! Douglas Crane's voice erupted in the confined cabin like a thunderclap, startling nearby passengers. He stood in the aisle, tall and red-faced, pointing down at Adrian Cross with an open palm that shook with fury and desperation. He doesn't belong in this section. He forged his way in. The buzz of quiet conversations instantly flared into alarmed murmurs. Heads turned. One man lowered his newspaper, another adjusted his glasses and stared. The overhead lights flickered slightly as if reacting to the tension building in the space. Several passengers began whispering theories to each other, some in disbelief, others in cautious agreement. First class was suddenly less about comfort and more about confrontation. Adrian remained seated, his expression unreadable, his posture dignified. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he allowed a slow rhythm to form as he tapped two fingers softly against his leather briefcase. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't nervousness, it was timing. His eyes, calm but focused, never left Douglas's face. He had seen this before, the moment when fear disguised itself as righteousness, when power cloaked itself in volume. He waited. A young steward, barely out of training, scurried toward the cockpit before anyone could direct him. The boy's name tag read Eli, and the panic in his steps betrayed his inexperience. Moments later, the cabin doors opened again, only this time with purpose. Two airport security guards stepped into the aisle with authority etched into every movement. One was tall, bald, with arms crossed firmly over a crisp uniform. The other, stockier and younger, scanned the room with a sharp eye. Douglas's face lit up like a man watching his long-awaited victory arrive. "There," Douglas barked, pointing again at Adrian. "That's him. He's the one. I want him off this plane." Now the guards moved forward, their boots thudding softly against the carpeted floor, eyes locking on Adrian. The older guard's hand moved near his belt, not to draw a weapon, but in readiness. The air grew heavy, as if the entire cabin held its breath. Passengers watched in silence, some with phones raised just enough to record without being noticed. The atmosphere teetered on the edge of chaos. Adrian, still seated, finally reached into his inner jacket pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, unthreatening. From within, he drew a black leather card case and flipped it open. What he produced was not a driver's license or a boarding pass, but something far more powerful. A single, matte black card with an embossed silver insignia. The moment the insignia caught the cabin lights, both guards paused mid-step. Their expressions changed, not dramatically, but enough for those watching closely to notice. Recognition flickered in the older guard's eyes. He lowered his hand from his belt and looked over at the steward, who was now standing rigidly near the galley. "Eli," the guard said, his voice steady but quiet. "What seat is Mr. Cross assigned to?" The steward's voice wavered. "Seat 1A, sir." Checked in, scanned, confirmed. Douglas took a step forward, undeterred. "That can't be right," he hissed. "This is some kind of game. He probably printed that thing himself. You're all being tricked." The younger guard exchanged a glance with his partner, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Meanwhile, Adrian finally spoke, his voice measured and unwavering. "You're accusing me of fraud, while standing in an aircraft partially owned by the company I helped build," he said, not to Douglas, but to the cabin. "You may raise your voice, but it doesn't change the facts." The weight of his words settled like fog over the crowd. A man across the aisle leaned back slowly, as though realizing he had misunderstood the moment. Another scratched his head and whispered to the man beside him, eyes wide with dawning realization. Douglas's fury didn't wane. It intensified. His hand shot forward, snatching Adrian's boarding pass off the tray where it lay beside the briefcase. In one swift motion he tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed louder than it should have. Gasps filled the cabin like an airlock had ruptured. Even the guards looked stunned. Adrian stood at last, tall and composed. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "You just destroyed property that wasn't yours to touch," Adrian said. His voice was not raised, but it cut like a blade. He did not move toward Douglas. He didn't have to. At that moment, the cockpit door opened. Captain Royce Menner stepped into the cabin, his flight cap still on, jaw tight. A career pilot with a strict sense of order, he surveyed the scene with sharp eyes. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Douglas turned instantly, launching into his version of events, voice trembling with rage. "Captain, this man is trying to hijack a seat he didn't pay for. He's faking. He's manipulating your crew. I demand he be removed." Menner's eyes moved from Douglas to the torn boarding pass, then to the card Adrian still held between two fingers. He squinted slightly, recognition dawning. "Mr. Cross," the captain said slowly, stepping closer. Are you with Lumevia Systems?" Adrian nodded once. "And I am an executive shareholder in the Branton-Halverth fleet acquisition deal." Silence. The kind of silence that reshapes a room. The captain exhaled and turned to the guards. "He's well within his rights." "Please step back," Douglas stumbled over his next words. You can't just let him. This is a first-class cabin. He shouldn't be." But his voice faltered under the weight of reality. No one responded. The guards stepped away. The steward turned his eyes to the floor. Adrian, still calm, closed his card case and slipped it back into his jacket. He did not gloat. He did not smirk. Instead, he turned slightly, looking at the passengers who had watched it all unfold. "Respect is not granted by silence," he said softly. "It's revealed in the moments people choose to act or stay quiet." No one replied. Douglas stood frozen in place, fury draining into humiliation. The power he thought he had held vanished like steam on glass. And yet the look on his face said he wasn't finished, not yet. His jaw clenched, a new plan forming behind angry eyes. The guards returned to their position near the bulkhead. The captain offered a brief nod to Adrian, then returned to the cockpit, closing the door firmly behind him. Passengers slowly began to murmur again, but the mood had changed. The balance of power had just shifted, and the cabin was no longer Douglas's stage. A storm was about to break, but not in the way Douglas expected. Douglas Crane's hand lunged like a striking hawk, snatching the boarding pass straight from Adrian's fingers. In one swift, reckless motion, he tore it clean down the center. The sharp rip echoed through the first-class cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted. One man dropped his coffee. Another lowered his newspaper with trembling hands. The hum of the jet's idle engines was drowned beneath a silence so thick it pressed against every window pane. Adrian did not flinch. His eyes, focused and calm, followed the shredded paper fluttering to the floor like broken feathers. His heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from calculation. His tall frame rose from the seat with deliberate composure, commanding attention without needing to raise his voice. He turned to Douglas, and when he spoke his tone was steady but firm, rich with the weight of authority that needed no badge or uniform. "You just destroyed property that wasn't yours to touch." Each word landed with the certainty of stone on still water, sending invisible ripples through the watching crowd. His voice wasn't loud, but the clarity with which he spoke left no room for doubt. Even those at the far end of the section leaned in, drawn by the gravity of his restraint. Douglas's eyes narrowed. For a moment he looked triumphant, puffed with the belief that he had finally pushed his opponent too far. But the applause he seemed to expect never came. The passengers weren't clapping, they were watching, and many now were frowning. Then came a new sound, the hiss of the cockpit door swinging open. Captain Royce Menner stepped out, his presence solid and commanding. He was in his late 50s, hair neatly parted, silver running through black like the edge of a blade. He walked with the confidence of a man who had steered aircraft through storms, but what he saw now unsettled him. "What's going on here?" the captain asked, his voice a notch below a bark. Douglas immediately stepped forward, face flushed and breath uneven. "Captain, I was disrespected. He doesn't belong here. He's causing a disturbance, and now he's accusing me." The captain raised a hand. "That's not what I asked." His eyes shifted to Adrian, who had not moved. The briefcase rested on his seat. The torn boarding pass lay at his feet, its halves speaking more truth than Douglas's voice ever could. Adrian met the captain's gaze. There was no need for a speech, no dramatic reveal. Instead, he calmly reached down, unlatched the briefcase, and pulled out a sleek black folder. From it, he withdrew a document, clean, crisp, and bearing the golden insignia of the airline itself. He extended it toward the captain. "These are my credentials," Adrian said. "I hold an equity stake in this airline through Lumivia Holdings. I boarded this flight under directive from our board's oversight division." The captain took the document, his expression shifting almost immediately. Recognition dawned in his eyes. The insignia was not unfamiliar. He scanned the page, his eyebrows knitting tighter with each line. Around them, the tension mounted, passengers whispering audibly now. Words like shareholder, executive, and oversight passed between seats. Douglas's jaw slackened. That's not real," he stammered, pointing with a trembling finger. "Anyone can print that. He's bluffing. This is a trick." But the captain ignored him. He turned back to Adrian, voice quieter now with something that edged close to respect. "Mr. Cross," the captain said carefully, "I recognize your name. I wasn't informed this flight was being used for board evaluation. It was meant to be anonymous," Adrian replied, his voice even. "But circumstances have made discretion difficult." Douglas sputtered beside them, his confidence bleeding into panic. "This isn't right." "He can't be. He's lying. You don't know how these people—" "Enough," the captain said firmly, his voice cutting through Douglas's words like a blade. "I'll ask you to return to your seat." Now the finality in his tone was undeniable. Douglas blinked, caught between defiance and disbelief. His hands twitched at his sides and he looked around for support, but found none. The very passengers he'd tried to rile up now stared at him with quiet disapproval, some shaking their heads, others avoiding his gaze entirely. His shoulders sagged slightly as he turned and shuffled back to his seat. But even as he sat, the defiance in his posture remained. A man not humbled, merely humiliated. The captain handed Adrian back the document. "If there's anything else you need, Mr. Cross, let me or my crew know." Adrian nodded, his voice low. "Thank you, Captain Menner." With a brief, solemn nod, the captain returned to the cockpit. The cabin slowly exhaled the breath it had been holding. Adrian sat once more, sliding the briefcase closed. His heart remained steady, but his thoughts moved rapidly. He knew what had just occurred was only the surface of something deeper. Douglas's words, his assumptions, and his arrogance. It all hinted at a mindset nurtured by something larger than ignorance. And Adrian had just exposed it without lifting a hand. The murmurs behind him faded into silence as the plane began final boarding. The balance of power had just shifted, and the cabin was no longer Douglas's stage. Douglas's voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. "That can't be real," he muttered, his eyes darting from the sleek documents in Adrian's hand to the captain's face. "This is some kind of trick, some scam." The desperation in his voice echoed louder than his words. He was still standing, but now the posture that once screamed dominance looked more like a man clinging to control. Captain Royce Menner didn't raise his voice, but his authority settled into the space like a final verdict. "It's real," he said simply, glancing down at the confirmation provided by Adrian. "Mr. Cross holds an executive shareholder position in the very company that operates this flight. I verified it myself." He gave Douglas a long look, filled with restrained disappointment, then turned slightly to address Adrian with quiet respect. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" Adrian shook his head slowly, his gaze never once shifting to Douglas. He didn't need to. Douglas's presence had already been diminished, like smoke fading in sunlight. "No," Adrian replied evenly. "I believe everything's been made clear." The silence that followed was unlike the earlier tension. It was heavy but focused, charged with understanding. Every passenger now knew the truth, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Men who had previously avoided eye contact with Adrian were now watching him with newfound recognition, some ashamed, others impressed, all caught in the gravity of the moment. They sat a little straighter, spoke a little softer. Douglas stumbled back a step. His mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. His flushed face betrayed him, red with humiliation, jaw twitching as he struggled to recover his image. This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "How could someone like you—" "Finish that sentence," Adrian said calmly, his tone like the edge of a blade, his voice carried even though he hadn't raised it. "Go ahead." Douglas froze. The implication behind Adrian's words cut through him faster than any accusation. His mouth clamped shut. Adrian finally turned to face him, his eyes sharp but composed. "You saw a man you didn't recognize and assumed he didn't belong. You judged based on skin and silence, not facts." He paused, his voice deepening with purpose. "But you were wrong. And you weren't just wrong about me. You were wrong about what power looks like." Douglas's hands twitched at his sides, fists half formed, but he didn't speak. For the first time he seemed unsure of where he stood, literally and figuratively. His footing had slipped, and the arrogance that once propelled him forward now dragged him back. The captain stepped forward, clearing his throat with just enough sharpness to cut the silence. "Mr. Crane, I suggest you return to your seat." Now Douglas hesitated, still breathing hard, but eventually nodded. The defiance in his expression was eroding. Wordlessly, he turned and walked back to his seat, the walk of a man whose empire had crumbled beneath him. The same passengers he once thought were allies now looked away, ashamed to have watched his spectacle without interference. His seat no longer looked like a throne, but a cage. Adrian remained standing a moment longer, not out of pride, but clarity. He looked across the cabin, meeting the eyes of those who had witnessed every second of the ordeal. "Respect," he said, his voice measured and strong, "isn't something you get to assign to others. It's not a privilege you hand out based on comfort or expectation. It's a choice, a standard, and it begins with how you treat the people you don't understand." He let the words hang in the air. No one challenged him. No one dared. The captain gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to the cockpit. Adrian sat down, his breathing steady but his mind already in motion. He had spoken his truth, but he could feel it, eyes still on him, glances filled not just with curiosity but calculation. Not all were relieved by his composure. Some, perhaps, were disturbed by it. That kind of quiet power often disrupted the hierarchies people didn't even realize they depended on. The steward walked past, slower this time, more careful, his eyes avoiding Adrian's completely. The message had been received, but it had unsettled more than just Douglas. There were layers here, conversations and resentments that didn't die with a public loss of face. Adrian felt it like static under his skin. He opened his briefcase slowly, sliding the documents back into their place. He didn't need them anymore, not for this part of the journey. What he needed now was focus. The tension hadn't left the cabin. It had simply shifted shape. Passengers were talking in hushed voices. The turbulence in the air was subtle, but it wasn't from weather or altitude. It was the aftershock of truth. Adrian leaned back, watching the reflections of cabin lights in the window. The city of Halvorth was still miles away, but a different journey had already begun. The meeting he was preparing for, the one that could determine the future of Lumevia Systems, was no longer the only fight he'd have to face. There were whispers in the walls now. Whispers of resentment, of hidden agendas, of challenges not yet named. Respect had been earned today, but exposure always invited backlash. The real battle had just begun, and Adrian was ready to face it. The cabin quieted, but the silence was uneasy, fragile. Adrian Cross remained seated, his spine straight, one hand resting on his briefcase while the other traced slow circles along the armrest. The atmosphere had shifted, not toward peace but toward a delicate balance where one wrong word could shatter it completely. Passengers avoided eye contact, some staring blankly at their screens, others thumbing magazines they clearly weren't reading. The echo of Douglas's earlier tantrum still clung to the cabin walls, like the last rumble of thunder after a storm that hadn't fully passed. Then came the whisper. Douglas Crane leaned slightly across the aisle, his voice low but laced with contempt. "Men like you need to learn their place," he murmured, his mouth curling into a half-smile that never touched his eyes. "You may dress the part, but don't forget, you're still just a visitor in our world." Adrian didn't look at him. He kept his eyes forward, jaw still, body motionless. But inside, something cold and precise stirred. This wasn't the first time he'd heard words like these, words that wrapped their hatred in casual phrasing, dipped in condescension, and spoken just quietly enough to avoid attention. What Douglas didn't understand, what men like him never seemed to understand, was that Adrian had built his world from the ground up, brick by brick, careful brick, deal by calculated deal. He wasn't visiting anyone's world. He had built his own. Nearby, a middle-aged man in a gray blazer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A younger man 2 rows back looked up from his tablet, frowning slightly. The passengers were listening now, even if they pretended not to. Some were appalled. Others just hoped to stay out of it. Silence, after all, was easier. Adrian's expression never changed, but the gears in his mind turned with clinical efficiency. Douglas's words weren't random. They were bait, and bait only worked on those who didn't know they were being lured. Adrian saw the trap clearly. Provoke a reaction, play the victim, twist the truth. The same pattern, again and again. He would not fall into it. The steward passed by slowly, his eyes flickering nervously between the 2 men. He paused for a breath too long, then quickly moved on. Adrian caught the hesitation. Fear. Not of Adrian, but of the fallout. That fear was telling. It meant Douglas's reach went further than expected. Adrian inhaled, slow and deliberate, and turned his head slightly toward the window. Outside, the crew finished sealing the cargo doors. The lights along the tarmac glowed in a hazy pattern beneath the night sky. The engines hummed low, steady, but inside the cabin, tension rose like water behind a dam. He could feel it, the shift in perception. The eyes of the passengers, the flight crew, even the pilot waiting silently behind that locked cockpit door. People were watching, waiting. He had revealed his credentials, his ownership stake, but some weren't ready to accept it. Some wanted a mistake to confirm their doubts. Douglas knew that. "You think this is over?" Douglas said again, voice barely audible over the engine's rising growl. "You'll regret embarrassing me." Adrian's eyes flicked to him then, briefly, but with such intensity that Douglas paused mid-breath. "If I embarrassed you," Adrian replied quietly, his voice like still water over steel, "it's only because your behavior revealed more than you intended." Douglas leaned back, momentarily silenced. But the look in his eyes wasn't defeat. It was calculation. He was waiting too, preparing. As the plane lifted into the sky, the seatbelt sign chimed and the cabin dimmed to a soft amber. Adrian kept his posture still, but his thoughts were already moving ahead. This was no longer about defending dignity. This was strategy. A line had been crossed, and he would not allow it to be crossed again. He reached into the side pocket of his briefcase and removed a notepad. Small, sleek, with a matte black cover. With a pen that glinted faintly in the overhead light, he began to write. Not just notes about Douglas, but patterns of behavior, crew reactions, hesitations from staff. Data. That's how you won wars, not with rage, but with records. A small voice of memory echoed in his mind. Malcolm Reed, his longtime mentor, had once told him, "The moment you raise your voice, you hand them the narrative. But the moment you raise evidence, you take it back." So Adrian kept writing. From the corner of his eye he saw Douglas shift again, unsettled by the silence. The man wanted chaos, but Adrian gave him calm. He wanted rage, but Adrian gave him record. The quiet was not surrender, it was a gathering force. Over the intercom, a flight attendant announced that the plane had reached cruising altitude. Lights dimmed further, some passengers pulled down shades, and the soft whir of air vents filled the space with a sterile, artificial calm. But the tension remained, hiding in corners like smoke in a sealed room. Adrian closed his notebook and tucked it into the inner pocket of his blazer. Then, turning slightly, he looked out the window again. A cloud bank shimmered below like rolling waves of silver. His reflection stared back faintly in the glass, composed, unreadable. He knew men like Douglas didn't act alone. Arrogance that strong often fed on quiet approval, on systems that protected it, on institutions that bent to its comfort. Douglas believed the confrontation had ended, but Adrian understood the truth. It had only just begun. And if the system had protected men like Douglas before, it would learn a new lesson now. The storm was circling closer, and Adrian knew he could not wait forever. Douglas struck like a snake the moment the seatbelt light dimmed. The aircraft had just leveled out, humming quietly beneath the clouds, and most passengers had begun settling into the soft lull of the flight. But not Douglas Crane. He leaned forward with sudden energy, his fingers rising stiffly to flag down one of the attendants, a younger man named Finn, no older than 22, with short blonde hair and a name tag that sat slightly crooked on his vest. Finn hesitated mid-step, eyes flicking between Douglas and Adrian, sensing tension but not understanding its roots. "That man," Douglas declared, loud enough to pierce the hum of conversation, "just threatened me." A ripple passed through the cabin. Heads turned. Whispers bloomed like a quiet storm building from the corners of the room. The older gentleman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. Two businessmen paused their whispered chat. A mother in row 1B instinctively pulled her toddler closer. Adrian Cross remained still. Finn blinked, clearly uncertain. I'm sorry, sir. What did you say happened?" "I said," Douglas repeated, his voice rising like the start of a courtroom speech, "that this man," he jabbed a finger toward Adrian, "threatened me with violence and tried to intimidate me using his so-called connections." The word connections was laced with mocking disdain. Douglas spoke like he was performing, his tone swinging from righteous to wounded. "He told me I'd regret speaking up, that he had the money and power to bury people like me." Adrian slowly turned his head. His face was unreadable, a mask carved from patience and principle. Inside, however, his pulse ticked harder, not from fear, but from strategy forming like a blueprint in his mind. This was not new, not the accusation, not the manipulation, not the way a loud lie could sway the crowd before the truth found its footing. Finn looked between the two men, his lips parting, unsure of protocol. "Sir, was there any physical contact?" "No," Douglas replied, narrowing his eyes. "Not yet. But it's only a matter of time with men like him." Adrian finally spoke, his voice even, clear. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Crane." Douglas scoffed. "The only mistake here is allowing you on this flight." A few passengers gasped, soft, audible reactions quickly muffled by awkward glances. Even Finn flinched, taken aback by the thinly veiled bigotry, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted. And Adrian knew how quickly seeds of doubt could grow in a cabin full of uncertain eyes and unwilling voices. He leaned back in his seat, breathing slowly through his nose, remembering the words Malcolm Reed once told him on a stormy afternoon in college after an unjust expulsion hearing. "Never fight chaos with chaos. Strategy is your strongest weapon, Douglas," emboldened by the moment, pressed on. "See? He's smug now. He thinks he's above the rest of us, hiding behind some fancy title, some shiny shoes and boardroom papers. But people like that? They always crack when you shine a little light." Some passengers began murmuring again, trying to parse out who Adrian really was, whether there might be truth buried under the drama. Adrian could feel it, the uncertainty, the shifting weight of public opinion. And he knew this was the moment to act, not with fire, but with precision. Without a word, he reached into the sleek leather briefcase at his feet. His hands moved with calm intent. The tension in the cabin thickened as if the entire aircraft leaned in to watch. From the inner flap, he pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was ivory white, crisp, with the bold insignia of the airline embossed in gold on the seal. Finn's breath caught. Even Douglas paused, thrown by the gesture. Adrian rose to his feet, slowly, deliberately. He faced Finn first, then allowed his voice to carry toward the surrounding seats, never raising it but filling the air with the quiet authority of a man who had waited long enough. "This," Adrian said, lifting the envelope so everyone could see, "is a directive from this airline's senior board." A flicker of confusion spread through Douglas's features. Adrian continued, "It authorizes me, as a verified shareholder, to conduct periodic oversight reviews of passenger experience, staff conduct, and in-flight operations. I am here today not just as a passenger, but as an evaluator under that directive." Finn took the envelope with both hands, eyes wide. He glanced down at the seal, then looked back up at Adrian, then over at the rows of watching passengers. He didn't need to open it. The weight of it, the symbolism, the legitimacy, was already doing its work. "You," Douglas started, stepping forward, his voice cracking with urgency. "You can't be serious. This is a bluff. He forged it. Anyone can make something look official." But his words were desperate now, a last grasp at control slipping through his fingers. The murmurs in the cabin had changed. They were no longer whispers of doubt, they were reactions of realization. The balance had shifted. "Sir," Finn said carefully, turning to Douglas, "I need you to return to your seat." Douglas balked. "You're going to believe him over me?" "I'm going to confirm this with the captain," Finn replied, but his tone had already betrayed where the scales were tipping. Adrian met Douglas's eyes. His voice was quiet but final. "You are standing on my plane, in a seat paid for by my company, under my authority." The silence that followed was total. The passengers froze. Even the engines seemed to hum lower for a breathless second. Finn clutched the envelope tightly as he stepped away to inform the cockpit. Douglas, unable to find any words that wouldn't crumble under their own weight, backed toward his seat. The mood had changed, not just in the tone of the passengers, but in the posture of the plane itself. Confidence had returned to Adrian's shoulders, not from triumph, but from clarity. He sat back down slowly. The whispers resumed, but this time they flowed in a different current. Even Douglas could sense it. But Adrian didn't relax. Not fully. He knew truth could quiet a room, but it didn't always silence a man. The evidence waited in his hands like a blade kept in reserve. He thought humiliating a black man mid-flight would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe dignity must always be defended, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The envelope in Adrian's hand felt heavier than paper should, its crisp edges pressed against his palm as he stood slowly, purposefully, the hush in the cabin wrapping around him like fog before a storm. Every eye followed his movement. Douglas, now rigid with growing panic, hovered nearby, ready to pounce on the next word, the next gesture, anything to twist back control. Adrian held the envelope high enough for all nearby passengers to see, its sleek seal bearing the insignia of Stratusvant Holdings, the parent company of the airline. Without fanfare, he unsealed it and withdrew the contents, a slim set of finely printed pages, official in tone and unmistakable in authority. The text, marked with a shareholder designation watermark, outlined specific powers granted to senior stakeholders, among them discretionary rights to evaluate crew performance, passenger interaction, and overall in-flight service quality. "This," Adrian began, his voice measured but firm, "is a directive issued by Stratusvant Holdings to all senior shareholders." His tone carried not just confidence, but clarity. "It grants oversight authority on this aircraft, including, but not limited to, passenger treatment and crew conduct." Passengers leaned forward, necks craning, some murmuring in surprise. The younger steward took a step back as if realizing the magnitude of the moment. Even the more aloof businessmen in adjacent seats put down their newspapers. Adrian looked directly at Douglas. "I am on official oversight duty for this flight." A ripple passed through the cabin. It was more than surprise, it was a collective reevaluation of everything they'd witnessed. One man coughed awkwardly, another straightened his tie. The tension that had once hovered over Adrian like a storm cloud now seemed to drift toward Douglas, who was visibly unraveling. From overhead, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Royce Menner. I've been informed that Mr. Adrian Cross is conducting an authorized shareholder oversight review. Please cooperate fully with all procedures." The weight of that confirmation landed like a hammer. Douglas's expression contorted. The color in his cheeks drained, only to return seconds later in a flush of crimson rage. His eyes darted between Adrian, the attendants, and the passengers now whispering openly. "You forged that," Douglas blurted, voice rising in pitch. "All of it." "It's fake." He stepped forward again, recklessly now. "I won't be silenced by this stunt. You're trying to humiliate me with fake documents and a smug voice." His words echoed with panic, but his body language still clung to defiance. He puffed his chest, his voice wobbling but loud. "This man is trying to control all of you with money. That's all this is." A trick. Adrian didn't move. His expression didn't even flicker. He simply met Douglas's glare with calm, unwavering resolve. Inside, his pulse had quickened, but not from fear. From precision. He had prepared for men like Douglas his entire life. Every step, every pause, every word was calculated. Then, quietly but with piercing intensity, Adrian spoke. "You are standing on my plane," he said, "in a seat paid for by my company." Under my authority, the words hit with the clarity of breaking glass. The cabin froze. For a moment, not a sound followed. Even the engines felt quieter. The passengers sat like statues, caught between disbelief and awe. One of the attendants took an unconscious step backward. Another simply blinked, as if seeing Adrian for the first time. The power in his voice wasn't loud. It was deeper than that. It was absolute. Douglas's arms, which had been raised in a gesturing frenzy, slowly lowered. His jaw worked uselessly, forming no words. The self-assured sneer had dissolved. Now, only a fragile mask of confusion and bruised ego remained. He searched for allies among the passengers, but found only silence, or worse, judgment. Adrian remained standing. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or smile. He just held Douglas's gaze until the man looked away, his confidence finally cracking under the weight of truth. But Adrian knew better than to believe the confrontation was over. He could feel the air still pulsing with unspoken tension. A wire pulled taut, but not yet snapped. The power had shifted, yes, but envy was a deeper enemy, one not so easily defeated. The truth had been revealed, but truth alone does not silence envy. The glass hit the floor with a sharp, violent crack. Shards scattered across the cabin aisle like tiny, glittering knives. Startled gasps erupted from the passengers closest to the scene. One woman yelped and shielded her face, while another clutched her seatbelt as if the aircraft itself had been struck. The crisp chime of impact echoed louder than it should have, breaking the taut silence that had hovered ever since Adrian Cross had calmly reclaimed his seat. Douglas Crane stood trembling, his chest heaving. His right hand was half raised, fingers spread wide in feigned shock. "He hit it out of my hand," Douglas shouted, his voice shrill with desperation. "He assaulted me." The nearby flight attendant froze mid-step, the tray in his hand wobbling slightly. Passengers craned their necks, whispering anxiously, their eyes darting between Adrian and Douglas, unsure of whom to believe. Some looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others watched with furrowed brows, disturbed by the sheer intensity of the moment. Adrian did not move. He remained perfectly still, seated with his spine straight and his hands resting on the arms of his chair. His eyes, calm and unblinking, stayed locked on Douglas. His expression gave away nothing. No anger, no fear, no confusion, just focus. It was the kind of gaze that didn't need volume to demand attention. But inside, his thoughts raced. He had seen this tactic before, false accusations used as a final gambit when control slipped away. The breaking of the glass wasn't just a tantrum, it was a strategy. Douglas's voice rose again, louder this time, hoping volume would mask the hollowness of his claim. "He threatened me earlier. He said he'd use his power to ruin me." He turned to the other passengers. "You all saw it." But no one nodded. No one spoke in agreement. The captain returned, storming down the aisle with the authority of someone who had just been pulled from a place he didn't want to leave. His brow was tight, his lips drawn into a line. Captain Royce Menner glanced down at the shattered glass, then at Douglas, then at Adrian. "What happened here?" he asked, voice low and firm. "He attacked me," Douglas said, pointing a trembling finger at Adrian. "He's been threatening me the whole flight." "I've tolerated enough." Captain Menner's gaze slid back to Adrian. "Mr. Cross?" Adrian slowly stood, brushing a glass shard from his cuff. "I've remained in my seat," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. "I haven't said a word to Mr. Crane since he threatened me before takeoff." Multiple passengers witnessed the exchange. They can speak for themselves. The captain's eyes swept the cabin. "Is that true?" he asked, this time speaking to the others. A pause. Then a man 2 rows behind raised his hand. "It's true," he said. "I saw the whole thing. The glass didn't get knocked out of his hand, it was thrown." Intentionally, another man across the aisle nodded. "Adrian hasn't moved." Douglas has been provoking him non-stop, a third voice, this one quieter, added. "He said something about making people learn their place." Douglas's face drained of color. "Lies," he barked. "They're lying for him. He's got them fooled." But the words rang hollow now. With every second, the ground beneath Douglas seemed to collapse. The false foundation he had built, his accusations, his bluster, was disintegrating in real time. Adrian remained upright, still silent, watching. The pieces were falling exactly as he had expected. Captain Menner's jaw flexed. "Mr. Crane," he said sternly, "you need to calm down. I will not allow this flight to descend into chaos because of your behavior." Douglas looked around, hoping for support, but saw only cold stares and turned faces. His shoulders sagged slightly, but his voice twisted into something darker. "Of course. Take his side. That's what this is about, isn't it?" he hissed. "Power, money, race, that's all that matters to you people." The cabin fell still again. The words hung in the air, bitter and heavy, impossible to ignore. Adrian's expression did not change, but his chest rose with a slow breath. Not of relief, but of resolve. He stepped forward slightly. "You've just said what you truly believe," he said quietly, "and now everyone has heard it." There was no satisfaction in his tone, no triumph, just truth, and truth, spoken plainly, held more weight than any accusation ever could. Douglas's eyes burned, not with victory, but with the kind of fury born from humiliation. Even now, even exposed, he looked for some way to regain control. But there was nothing left to grab onto. The mask had shattered along with the glass. Captain Menner signaled 2 attendants. "Escort Mr. Crane back to his seat. He's not to leave it for the rest of the flight." The 2 male attendants approached, wary but firm. Douglas protested, barked, cursed under his breath, but ultimately sat down under their watch. Adrian returned to his seat as well. The cabin remained tense, but the energy had shifted. The passengers who once stared at him with suspicion now saw him with quiet respect. And yet Adrian knew better than to let down his guard. This was a victory, yes, but not the final one. His gaze drifted toward the steward in the galley, the one who had hesitated earlier, who had stood frozen when the first confrontation began. The fear in his eyes wasn't for Douglas, it was for something else, something beneath the surface. Adrian saw it now with painful clarity. Douglas was not an anomaly. He was a symptom, and if symptoms were to be treated, the illness that allowed them to thrive had to be confronted head-on. Adrian exhaled slowly, the pressure behind his eyes easing but never vanishing. He leaned back into his seat, the leather cool against his shoulders. In the reflection of the cabin window, he caught sight of his own face. Calm, composed, but not untouched. The journey ahead would not end at landing. It would deepen, because exposing one man's hate was not enough. The system itself had to be challenged. The captain's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the decision. "That's enough," he said, the authority in his tone silencing the last of Douglas's furious outbursts. "Restrain him for the remainder of the flight." 2 male attendants approached. Their steps were slow, uncertain, as if the air around Douglas still burned from the fury he'd just unleashed. They looked to the captain for reassurance, and only after a firm nod did they act. Douglas didn't go quietly. He barked protests the entire way back to his seat, his voice raw with indignation. "You'll regret this," he snarled as one attendant secured the restraint strap across his lap. "I'll have your jobs, every last one of you." The second attendant flinched but said nothing. The captain lingered for a moment, eyes locked with Douglas's. Then, without a word, he turned and walked briskly toward the cockpit, closing the door behind him with a finality that echoed through the cabin. For a moment, silence fell over the first-class cabin like a dropped curtain. Then came the exhale, the collective release of breath passengers hadn't realized they'd been holding. Murmured conversations resumed, hesitant and hushed. The woman across the aisle adjusted her reading glasses. A businessman 3 rows back scrolled his phone with renewed intensity. The tension had not left. It had only been pushed below the surface. Adrian Cross sat back down. His posture was relaxed to the eye, but inside, his mind churned like a storm tide. His heart beat with a steady thud, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous: strategy. He understood men like Douglas. He had faced them before. But what lingered wasn't just the threat of an angry man, it was the quiet tremble he'd seen in the crew. When the attendants had moved to restrain Douglas, they had hesitated. Not because they doubted the order, but because they feared the man issuing it. That fear was telling. It meant Douglas's reach didn't stop at arrogance. It suggested leverage, influence, power. The very thing Douglas had accused Adrian of wielding unjustly now hung around his own shoulders like a hidden blade. Adrian turned to the window, watching the night sky blur past in streaks of cloud and stars. He didn't see the stars, though. He saw the steward's pale face when Douglas had barked threats. He saw the glances exchanged between crew members when the captain spoke Adrian's name with respect. He saw the uncertainty in the eyes of men who should have known better. He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out his leather-bound notebook. The snap of the clasp broke the ambient drone of the cabin. He clicked open his pen and began to write, not hurriedly, but methodically. The act wasn't just to preserve memory, it was to create record, an account that couldn't be erased, misquoted, or ignored. He wrote down each key moment, each reaction, each expression, page after page. He drew a line and jotted the question that had been whispering in his mind since the very first confrontation. Why did Douglas act like a man who couldn't be touched? Adrian glanced toward Douglas, who now sat slouched in his seat, arms crossed and eyes burning with a slow, simmering hatred. But what struck Adrian wasn't the look of defeat. It was the faint curl of a smile at the edge of Douglas's mouth, a smirk that didn't belong to someone who had lost. He's not finished, Adrian thought. He looked to the attendants, who returned to their duties as if nothing had happened. But their movements were cautious, like soldiers walking a field they no longer trusted. One of them, dark-haired, young, maybe mid-20s, cast a fleeting glance at Douglas, then looked away quickly when he noticed Adrian watching. That glance spoke volumes. Adrian's mind connected the dots, each one darker than the last. Douglas's aggression wasn't random, it was emboldened. He had acted not like a man confronting a stranger, but like someone who expected to be backed, who assumed that even when wrong, he would be protected. The crew's discomfort, the steward's early hesitation, even the way one guard on the tarmac had looked away when Adrian first boarded, it all pointed to something deeper. There was structure behind this behavior, not just one man's prejudice, but something institutional, embedded, untouched. Adrian closed his notebook and stared at the seatback in front of him. He had come on this flight expecting to prepare for a board presentation in Halvorth, an acquisition proposal that could double Lumevia's influence across Europe and the Pacific. But now something else had taken precedence. This wasn't just about surviving a flight. It was about understanding the architecture of arrogance, how it was built, how it was maintained, and how it could be dismantled. "Would you like a drink, sir?" the steward asked, appearing beside him with a tight smile and a tray of bottled water. Adrian looked up, studying the man's face. There was no hostility, but there was something else: uncertainty. The kind that came from serving two masters, duty and fear. "No," Adrian said softly. "Thank you." The steward nodded and moved on. Adrian sat back, the soft hum of the engines filling the silence. He turned the reading light on, casting sharp angles across his suit, his face, his notebook. His pen hovered over the next blank page. He didn't write yet. Instead, he listened, to the sounds around him, to the rhythms of the cabin, to the instincts that had kept him rising where others had tried to pull him down. There was more to this. He could feel it. The pilot announced they would begin their descent in 1 hour. The lights dimmed. Around him, passengers dozed off or scrolled through quiet screens. The night returned to its illusion of peace. But peace, Adrian knew, was never free, and silence was rarely empty. He opened his notebook again, scribbled one last line, and underlined it twice. Find out who gave Douglas that smirk. And then he leaned back in his seat, eyes wide open in a cabin that slept uneasily. The battle was moving to a larger stage, and Adrian was preparing for the next strike. The wheels screeched as they met the tarmac, the familiar jolt rolling through the fuselage as the aircraft landed at Halvorth International. The cabin filled with the low hum of relieved murmurs, overhead bins clicked under settling pressure, and seatbelts tightened across laps. Yet amid the rustling and subtle cheers, Adrian Cross remained perfectly still, his spine straight, his pen tapping softly against his open notebook. His eyes didn't wander toward the windows or the other passengers. They stayed fixed on the aisle ahead, alert, calm, calculating. Douglas Crane sat across from him, restrained by order, his posture stiff and arms crossed tightly. The cordon of silence between them had stretched thin. And now, after hours of being silenced and exposed, Douglas wore a new expression, not of anger or humiliation, but a smirk. It was thin, controlled, and dangerous. It wasn't the grin of a man defeated. It was a warning. Adrian's gaze locked onto that smirk. Something about it unsettled him, not for what it showed, but for what it concealed. He knew men like Douglas didn't accept consequences easily. They always had another layer of protection, another friend in the shadows, another string to pull. His fingers stopped tapping. His pen clicked closed. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign turning off broke the tension. A moment later, the front cabin door creaked open and the cold light of the jet bridge filtered in. Uniformed ground officers stepped in briskly. 3 of them, all men, all silent. They carried not urgency, but intention. Heads turned. Passengers straightened in their seats. Phones lowered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Adrian expected them to move toward Douglas. They didn't. Instead, all 3 men turned toward Adrian's row with measured steps. Their boots thudded softly against the carpeted aisle, but the impact was thunderous. The steward, still standing near the galley, blinked in confusion. A murmur rose among the passengers, low and uncertain, like the first roll of distant thunder. "You'll need to come with us, sir," said the officer in front, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying a calm but unreadable face. His nameplate read J. Branner. Adrian blinked once, his breath quiet. "Is there a reason?" "There have been serious allegations filed during the flight," Branner replied. "We've been asked to escort you for questioning." There was a moment of pure silence, suspended like a held breath. Douglas let out a low, quiet chuckle. "Guess ownership doesn't buy you everything," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The smirk returned in full. Adrian's mind moved quickly. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was leverage, a message, influence, deployed at the last possible moment. Douglas had made his move. A man in the row behind stood up suddenly. Wait, that can't be right," he said. "We saw what happened." That man, he pointed at Adrian, was calm the entire flight. The other one was the problem? Another voice chimed in from a few rows back. He didn't do anything wrong. He was the one being harassed. Branner didn't react. His training was clear: follow protocol, stay neutral, no matter the passenger protests. But his eyes flickered with something, a crack in the official mask. Adrian nodded slowly, closed his notebook, and stood up. Every movement was deliberate. His voice remained low and calm. "I will come with you," he said, looking Branner directly in the eye. "But know this, I have documentation, recordings, and witness statements. Whatever this is, it won't hold. We're just here to transport, sir." "Not to judge," Branner said, almost apologetically. As Adrian stepped into the aisle, a pair of passengers reached out, trying to offer support, but he simply nodded to them and walked forward without breaking stride. Dignity was not an accessory. It was armor. He passed Douglas on the way out. Douglas didn't speak, but the grin on his face grew wider. His eyes gleamed, not with victory, but with the satisfaction of knowing his reach extended past the cabin, past the aircraft, into systems that had always bent to his will. Outside the plane, the air was colder than expected. The sterile brightness of the terminal hallway contrasted sharply with the warm discomfort of the cabin. Adrian walked between the 2 officers, silent, measured. Inside, his mind raced, not with panic, but with precision. He reviewed his legal protections, the chain of ownership documents, the recorded testimonies, the policies he had helped write. He understood now. This wasn't about a seat, or even about a flight. This was about who got to belong, who got to lead, and who got to define the rules inside institutions designed to exclude while pretending to be neutral. When they reached the side hallway leading to the airport security annex, Branner stopped briefly to unlock the next door. Adrian turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the terminal beyond. Cameras were out. Passengers were pointing. Word was spreading. Inside that annex waited another battle, of narratives, of paperwork, of perception. But Adrian was ready. He adjusted his tie. Landing did not bring peace. It brought a deeper storm waiting in the terminal. The door slammed shut behind Adrian Cross with a mechanical finality, the thick click of the lock echoing louder than it should have in the sterile airport office. Fluorescent lights flickered slightly above, casting a pale glow over the room's bare walls and metal filing cabinets. Across the table sat Lieutenant Garrick, a tall man with a regulation-cut mustache and tired eyes that had seen too many disputes, yet perhaps none quite like this. Without a greeting, Garrick opened a gray folder and began reading aloud, his voice dry and deliberate. Subject allegedly threatened fellow passenger, initiated verbal assault, destroyed airline property, and caused undue disruption to flight operations. He paused and looked up, his brow furrowing slightly as he read the next line silently. Then he let the folder rest on the table, folding his hands. "Mr. Cross," he said slowly, "this is the statement submitted under formal complaint by Mr. Douglas Crane. Based on the report, you're facing multiple allegations." Adrian didn't flinch. He had expected this. "I didn't come here unarmed," Adrian replied, his tone calm but lined with steel. From his briefcase, he retrieved a slim black case and opened it with practiced care. Inside, he pulled out a stack of printed statements, eyewitness accounts from fellow passengers, and a USB drive containing several video clips, time-stamped and verified, documenting every major event from the flight. Garrick took the items silently, his gaze flickering with interest. As he inserted the drive into a monitor behind him, the grainy footage played. Douglas shouting, Douglas tearing the boarding pass, Adrian remaining seated, composed, unprovoked. Another angle showed the glass Douglas had thrown, shattering at his own feet. A third clip captured the captain confirming Adrian's status to the entire cabin. Garrick leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. "These are compelling," he admitted. "But understand something, Mr. Cross. There are forces at work here that don't care about clips or statements." Outside the frosted glass window of the office, Douglas Crane could be seen pacing like a caged animal, his gestures wild, his lips forming sharp words. Occasionally, he stopped to speak with someone, an officer, a man in a dark suit, an airport supervisor, each interaction leaving a ripple of unease in their wake. Adrian followed Garrick's gaze. "He's not finished, is he?" "No," Garrick said with a low sigh. "And neither are his backers." Adrian turned his full attention to the officer, studying him. Garrick looked conflicted, the weight of duty pressing against the weight of influence. There was an honesty in his eyes, but also a resignation, as if he'd been here before, watching truth bend under pressure. "Lieutenant," Adrian said, his voice steady, "what exactly are we dealing with?" Garrick closed the folder slowly. "Douglas Crane isn't just some belligerent passenger. His uncle sits on the Regional Aviation Compliance Board. His father used to be the Deputy Commissioner of Airport Operations for this entire state, and a handful of our own personnel owe their careers to that family. This isn't just about the flight anymore." Adrian felt the sting of realization settle in his chest, not as panic, but as clarity. So that was the game. Not justice, not protocol. Influence. He leaned back in his chair, interlocking his fingers. "You've seen the evidence. You know the truth. Yet you're warning me. I'm preparing you," Garrick corrected, not unkindly, "because this won't stop at this room. The report that came across my desk wasn't just sent to me. It's being pushed up and out. Someone wants to escalate this, make it official before it can be questioned." "Why?" Adrian asked. Garrick hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "Because what you represent terrifies them. Power in the hands of someone who doesn't play by their rules, someone they can't control. If they can make you the aggressor, they keep their system clean." Adrian's jaw tensed. "So, I'm the threat now." "You always were," Garrick said quietly, "just by existing where they don't want you." The air grew still between them. Adrian broke the silence first. "Then let me be clear, Lieutenant. I won't let their lies define this moment, and I won't walk out of here quietly." Garrick looked down at the statements again. The footage paused on the screen behind him, Adrian standing, firm and composed, while Douglas shouted nonsense that no longer held weight. "You're smart," Garrick said finally, "and you came prepared. That'll buy you time, but you need to understand what you're up against." Adrian stood. "I already do." As he gathered his materials, Garrick reached across the table, sliding a plain white card toward him. "If anything else happens, before this is over, You call me directly, but don't expect protection from the others." Adrian took the card without a word and slid it into his briefcase. Outside, Douglas's voice echoed faintly through the corridor, still demanding, still convinced that he was untouchable. Adrian stepped toward the door, pausing only briefly to look back at Garrick. "Lieutenant," he said, "I don't fear tall walls. I just make sure they know I can climb," and with that, he exited. Inside the office, Garrick sat alone, the folder still open, the screen still frozen on the truth. He muttered under his breath. The walls of corruption were taller than expected, but they were not unbreakable. Flashes from camera shutters strobed against the walls of the press room, their light bouncing off sleek marble floors and chrome railings. Adrian Cross stood at the podium, the quiet tension in his jaw the only betrayal of the storm he had weathered. Behind him, a bank of screens displayed still images from the flight, security footage from the airport, and sharp screenshots of Douglas Crane mid-rage, frozen moments of injustice now turned into evidence. The room buzzed with murmurs, but all fell silent the moment Adrian leaned forward and adjusted the microphone. "This isn't about a seat," he began, his voice clear and unwavering. "It's about a structure, one that allowed arrogance to masquerade as authority and silence to become complicity." Outside the room, protesters chanted beneath banners reading "Justice for Adrian" and "Accountability Now," their voices echoing through the glass walls of the terminal. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, heavy with anticipation and unspoken reckoning. News anchors typed furiously on tablets. Some looked up at Adrian with respect, others with cautious calculation, uncertain how the public would digest the narrative he was about to unfold. Adrian did not pace, did not shout. He let his composure do the work. He reached into the leather portfolio beside him and pulled out a folder, laying its contents carefully across the podium surface: transcripts, time-stamped video stills, audio clips transcribed and verified by digital analysts. Everything had been authenticated. I was called a fraud. I was accused without cause. I was almost removed from a flight on which my company holds a controlling stake. His eyes swept the crowd. But I didn't come here to demand punishment. I came to ask a harder question. How did this happen in a system that should have known better? Reporters raised hands, but Adrian wasn't done. He gestured toward the far wall where an interactive screen now played footage taken by a fellow passenger, Douglas snatching Adrian's boarding pass, yelling slurs, and accusing him of lying even as security tried to de-escalate. The audio crackled slightly, but the hate in Douglas's voice was undeniable. "This," Adrian said, letting the footage run, "was not the failure of one man. It was the permission of many." A ripple of unease moved through the room. Men who had sat comfortably behind policy and protocol suddenly realized the walls were thinner than they appeared. Adrian's gaze shifted to the representatives of the airline's board seated in the second row, their expressions stiff. The CEO of the airline, a silver-haired man named Randall Voss, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had refused to issue a personal apology until now. Behind the scenes, things had already begun to shift. Boardroom meetings turned hostile. Shareholders demanded explanations. Pressure mounted from civil rights groups and corporate ethics watchdogs. Adrian had forced them into a corner, not with rage, but with facts. After the press conference, a quiet but urgent meeting was held in the airline's executive office on the top floor of the terminal. Adrian entered without ceremony, the weight of the room pressing against him like gravity. Randall stood to greet him, his voice low. "The board has agreed. Douglas Crane will be permanently banned from all flights under our network, and several within airport administration have stepped down." Adrian nodded, unsurprised. "That's a start." "There's more," Randall added, clearing his throat. "We'd like you to consider chairing a new committee. Oversight, internal reform, training initiatives, rooting out the kind of rot that led to this." For a moment, Adrian didn't answer. He turned to the window, watching the tarmac where planes taxied in the golden light of afternoon. Somewhere out there, passengers sat unaware of the battle that had been fought for one man's right to be seen and respected. "Not for status," Adrian finally said, turning back, "but for principle." The agreement was sealed that day, quietly but powerfully. And by evening, Adrian stood once more at the podium, this time not as the accused but as the architect of change. As the final questions died down, a journalist asked if he had anything else to add, something personal. Adrian's hand rested on the edge of the podium. He looked straight into the lens of the lead camera, his voice clear and steady. Respect is not granted by a seat or a title. It is earned by truth, and truth will always rise. Seconds later, his smirk vanished. The man he mocked owned the very plane he sat in. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, prejudice, and the danger of judging others based on stereotypes. Its purpose is to raise awareness, challenge bias, and encourage respect, equality, and empathy in everyday interactions.